A nossa atividade aqui, organizada pelos alunos do Centro Acadêmico de Economia, né? Também pela pós-graduação em Economia da UFABC. Desejo a todos vocês uma ótima noite e agradeço a presença, né? Um primeiro recado, antes de nós iniciarmos os trabalhos, é que vocês estão vendo aqui um code que vai permitir para aqueles que precisarem acessar a tradução simultânea. Se por acaso alguém entender, porque nós vamos trocar os slides daqui a pouco, faz um sinalzinho, por favor, para os nossos queridos estudantes do Gabriel, que ele passa com um code para vocês. Tá? Bom, o Centro Acadêmico me autorizou, então vou iniciar. Além das boas-vindas, né, eu queria salientar nosso agradecimento muito especial para a professora Meurs, que está aqui conosco, porque é um momento muito emblemático do Programa de Pós-Graduação em Economia. É importante salientar nesse momento que o curso de Economia, de modo geral, é um curso que tem avançado na graduação com a participação das mulheres, mas que na pós-graduação ainda está tateando. Dados recentes de 2023 do Sistema Nacional de Pós-Graduação indicam que somente 44% dos docentes de nível pós-graduado são mulheres. Na economia, em média, esse número é menor, é em torno de 22%. O nosso programa tem o prazer de dizer que estamos avançando nesses indicadores. Nós temos 28% das nossas docentes mulheres e o número de estudantes também tem aumentado. Mas ainda é pouco para os desafios da igualdade de gênero e da inclusão. Então é nesse momento em particular, onde há um retrocesso no avanço das mulheres no país de origem da professora Meurs, que trazê-la no mês das mulheres para abrir a Aula Magna de Economia, da pós-graduação em Economia, passa a ser um momento muito especial para nós, mulheres, homens, pessoas interessadas no desenvolvimento humano, na inclusão social e na melhoria de indicadores, não só associados à pós-graduação, mas associados ao ensino, ao conhecimento e à interdisciplinariedade que marca o nosso programa. Então, com muito prazer, eu introduzo para vocês a professora Meurs, que vai ser apresentada pela professora Ana Abras, e abro com vocês uma salva de palmas muito carinhosa, os trabalhos com a professora Meurs e a mediação da professora Ana Abras. Muito obrigada.
Boa noite, caros e caras. Eu vou fazer o CV é muito longo, então vou fazer uma introdução rápida da nossa palestrante hoje. É um prazer receber a professora Mieke Meurs, da American University. Ela é professora titular do Departamento de Economia, é pró-reitora associada dos programas de pós-graduação, co-diretora do Programa de Estudos de Análise de Gênero na American University. Gostaria de ressaltar que é um dos lugares nos Estados Unidos onde se oferece uma linha na pós-graduação para estudar gênero. Sem muita delonga, passo para a nossa palestrante.
Thank you for this introduction. Welcome, everybody. I'm sorry that I don't speak very much Portuguese, so tonight I'm going to speak in English, but I hope you will be able to understand me with my English. The Portuguese slides, which I hope will appear soon, and your translation app.
Todo mundo consegue ver?
about what feminist economics is and also what it isn't, and also to explain why I think that feminist economics is a very important tool for addressing problems that we face in the 21st century. So, this is Professor Jayati Ghosh, who is a professor of economics at the University of Massachusetts in Amherst, a place that some of us here tonight know and love. And she published an article recently in the online publication of the International Monetary Fund, Finance and Development. And in this article, one of the important things that she said was that the need for drastic change in economics, in the economics discipline, has never been so urgent. Now, I wonder if any of you have an idea why she might have said that. Why do you think she said that? Nobody wants to guess? Of course, I'm going to tell you why I think she said that, but no volunteers. Okay, fine. So what I think she meant by that is that she was thinking about what some people are calling the triple crisis of social sustainability. This triple crisis that people are talking about might include many things. I think Jayati Ghosh was thinking about three things. She was thinking about climate crisis. She was thinking about the crisis brought about by the aging of the population across really almost all countries of the globe, in which more and more older people are having to be supported by a smaller and smaller number of people who are working age. And of course, she was also thinking about the crisis of rising inequality in the world. And she was saying that economics is in urgent need of change because economics in its current form is not able to address these polycrises that the world is facing. So I don't want to start out by saying that I think that standard economics is useless, because that is not what I think. So, of course, I want to start by recognizing the tools, the important tools that standard economics has given us. So, first of all, it gives us, we need a slide change. First of all, it has given us an analytical framework for understanding individual behaviors, including the choices that we make that add up to aggregate economic outcomes. Standard economics has provided us with very important statistical tools for looking at patterns and relationships between variables and over time. And standard economics has given us macroeconomic models that capture the interactions between different sectors of the economy, between different kinds of agents, and allow us to predict aggregate economic outcomes. All three of those things are very important contributions and analytical tools, which I think we should continue to use. But, next slide, please. Yeah. Traditional economics has some very serious omissions. That's the mistake. So, traditionally, economics has focused on markets. Okay? And we're going to talk more about that in just a minute. But research shows that between 25 and 40% of production in most economies occurs outside of market production. Between 25 and 40%. So an economics that studies markets is missing a very big chunk of the economy. And in some countries like Tanzania, for example, the share of the economy outside markets is even much higher, around 60%. Next slide, please. So, do people recognize this? Just wave your hand if you recognize this picture. Okay, good. So if you opened your economics textbook, you probably saw this picture. Okay, so this is what standard economics does. It focuses on market activity. So in your standard economics class, you study the relationship between firms and households. So firms send goods and services to households, and households send their money back to the firms to purchase goods, right? And households send factors of production, that's labor, and savings to the firm, and again, the firm sends back wages. So this is the picture of the economy. But you notice that the only thing in the picture is the things that go through markets. So exchanging labor in a market and exchanging products in a market. So anything that's not going through a market, according to this view of the economy, is not in the economy, right? And that's where I was saying that picture leaves out a quarter to 40% of the economy. So a foundational principle of feminist economics is that economics has got to include the analysis of all aspects of how societies organize the provision of their material needs. Feminist economists call this social provisioning to emphasize the fact that the things that we need to survive and live come through all different kinds of social relations, not only those that exist in a market. And they include, in addition, then, production that takes place in the household. So this picture, which I like very much, is from the cover of a book by a feminist economist named Nancy Foley. And this is the cover, this picture is actually an old poster from the 1930s from a labor movement. And the point here is capitalism also depends on domestic labor. That domestic labor, labor that takes place in the home, is important for capitalism. It produces important products that capitalism needs. In particular, we see here that it produces people, right? So the poster shows people coming out of the factory here in the evening tired. They come into the household, and this woman is kind of remaking the person in the household, feeding them, making sure they have clean clothes, and so on. And then in the morning, of course, they go back into the factory, right? So I like this poster a lot. It makes the point that domestic work is also part of the capitalist economy. It's also part of production. But also, look what the poster designer has done. They have made the household look like a factory, right? This is an assembly line. So the poster maker is trying also in a visual way to make this point about how work in the household is productive work. So this is one of the key points that feminist economics tries to make, is that we need to think about the parts of the economy which are outside markets as being productive. And I'll come back to that point. Okay, next slide. Okay, so this idea, which I think is very firmly grounded in feminist economics, that there are things which don't have prices, which don't go through markets, but which are very important for the economy, can be extended to other areas of the economy where important resources and production do not have prices. So here, what we're thinking about is unpriced environmental resources, right? So clean air, clean groundwater, biodiversity, green space are all also things that we use in the economy, we consume in the economy, they go into production, and just like domestic labor, they have no price. Right? They don't go through a market, they don't have a price. And because of that, economists don't, standard economics does not deal with these because they're not in the market and they don't have prices. Next slide. So that's the first point that I think feminist economics makes, which is going to be an important tool for us in addressing the triple crisis. The next point that feminist economics has made is kind of to counter the idea of homo economicus. So how many of you have heard of homo economicus? Okay. So homo economicus is this kind of very generic standard agent who maximizes his utility, right? And has fixed preferences and so on and so forth. So feminist economics has argued that this is a very wrong way to think about economic behavior because economic agents are structurally very different. So this diagram, I'm sorry I didn't provide a citation here, it comes from the very unradical organization of the World Bank. This is from a World Bank publication, and here what they're trying to show us in this diagram is different ways that different agents are going to come to the economy in different kinds of positions, right? So we see that in terms of informal institutions like social norms, right? Different kinds of agents are going to come to the market, come to the economy, bearing different social norms. And those will affect their choices, their behaviors, the kinds of advantages and disadvantages they have. And so we cannot think about decisions thinking about homo economicus. We have to talk about different concrete kinds of people who come with different kinds of social norms. When we come to markets, markets seem like a very gender, race, ethnicity, neutral institution. A market, supply and demand, what does it care about those things, right? But in fact, different kinds of people of different genders and races and sexualities and so on come to a market and have a very different experience. So we need to think about those kinds of differences when we think about how markets work. Of course, households are also a way, a location, framework through which different kinds of agents participate in the economy differently, right? Why do women mostly raise the kids and do the laundry? And why do men mostly participate in the labor market, right? Those are different arrangements that make people enter into the economy in different ways, right? And then, of course, we have formal institutions. Luckily, more and more formal institutions are treating people who are different races and genders the same. But not everywhere. There are many countries in which women can still not use banking services in the same way that men can, still don't have the same rights to have titles to land and other assets that men have. And I would like to say that I was in high school before my mother was allowed to get a credit card in her own name, right? So these inequalities, kind of structural inequalities, are still with us and still affecting us today. And so the point that this diagram from the World Bank is making is that all of these different structural inequalities that different kinds of people face affect how they can participate in the economy, which is this big picture. And then here we have the outcomes. So the way you can act, your agency, the kind of endowments you're going to have that you can use to make your choices with, and the kind of economic opportunities you're going to face in the economy are all different because of structural differences. And so this has been one other very important point that feminist economics has made, is that we cannot do analysis from the perspective of homo economicus. We need to do analysis from the perspective of real different kinds of people who enter into the economy in different ways. And the third key point that I would like to make in terms of how feminist economics suggests we do economics differently is that feminist economists have argued that we should consider as the goal of the economy well-being of people and also increasingly of the planet. So I didn't get much popular participation. Did we skip a slide? Can you go back one? Oh, slide seems to have gotten lost in translation. But that's okay. Okay, so there should be one slide in between here. I'm sorry, it's missing, which says that that the goal of an economy should be the well-being of people and the planet. Okay? So, oh, there is it. It just looks really different. Good. Okay, good. Thank you for pointing that out. Translation is not so good. Okay, so what do you think is the goal of standard economics? When you read a standard economic textbook, what is the purpose of the economy? You can just shout. Anybody can shout out.
Produce more with less.
Yeah, well, it's produce more with less. Efficiency, I would translate that as. Anybody else? Yes.
It will be.
Not in my textbook. unless by that you mean Pareto optimality, you might mean that. Anybody else? So sometimes going back to Adam Smith, economic growth, right? Okay, so these quotes, I think, kind of make this point. So Marshall, who is sometimes thought of as the grandfather of microeconomics, back in 1920, he said this about well-being, right? He said that economics examines the part of individual and social action which is most closely connected with the attainment and use of material requisites of well-being. Okay, so in 1920, this was accepted in economics, that the goal should be well-being. But only a few years later, 1935, Robbins says, oh no, economics is the study of human behavior as the relationship between ends, outcomes, and scarce means. How many of you remember this one from your textbook? Kind of the standard one now, right? And that's efficiency. Someone kind of said more output with less. I think I heard somebody say that. Yeah, so that's efficiency. Okay, so feminist economists have said, no, that's not the goal of the economy. That could be a tool to get there, or maybe not, but that's not the goal. The goal is, like Marshall said, well-being. Now, those of you who are serious micro-theorists in the audience might say, well, but efficiency is supposed to be the way that you get to well-being, right? If you produce more with less, there'll be more. And we can share it all any way we want. And so those two things should be the same. But what feminist economists argue is they're not the same. Why are they not the same? There are two reasons. Oops, next slide, please. Yeah. There are two reasons why they are not the same. The first one is that when you maximize through markets, right, to produce the most cheaply or get the most for the least cost, you're basing those decisions on prices. But prices do not always reflect the value of something, right? They don't always reflect scarcity. Think about those things I was talking about earlier that don't have prices. Does that mean that the household labor that we do is worth zero? Would anybody argue that raising a child or cleaning the laundry or cooking dinner is worth zero? Right? And would you argue that clean air or clean water or biodiversity is worth zero? No. Right? So the prices that we use to figure out how to produce more with less are the wrong prices. So producing more with less does not lead to the maximization of well-being. Right? And the second reason why it's simply not true is that feminist economists reject the second fundamental welfare theorem. The idea which that theorem says that, well, you don't have to worry about inequality. Because if you just make the pie as big as possible, then you can share it any way you want. Right? So inequality is not something you should worry about until afterward and when they will redistribute the wealth. But is there anybody here who believes that the choices that you're making while getting to making the pie as big as possible are not influenced by inequality? Right? So if I have to make a choice of what kind of job will I take? How much money will I spend on my child's education? Will I live in a safe neighborhood or a dangerous one? Are those choices, which are part of the maximization process of making the pie big, are they not influenced by inequality? Right? So you cannot first make the choices and maximize the pie and then redistribute, because the decisions themselves are caused by the distribution of income, right? So feminist economists have said, no, we have to put well-being first and maximize that. So that's the third kind of big difference, I would say, between feminist economics and traditional economics. So that brings us, yes, to the next slide. So this is a picture of Elinor Ostrom. Does anybody know who Elinor Ostrom is? A few hands going up there. So she is the first woman to get a Nobel Prize in economics. In fact, her PhD is not even in economics. It was in political science. She's passed away now. But Elinor Ostrom said, as you can see here, that gender economics, or what I call feminist economics, is good economics. It's good science, and it's good econometrics. Okay? So the point of this is that feminist economics is not only about gender or women, right? It's about how we do economics. It's about taking seriously unpriced inputs, right? Thinking about the economy as all of our activity, not just those that go through markets. It's about thinking about people as being structurally different, and it's about prioritizing welfare as opposed to efficiency. So Julie Nelson, so I guess this was hard to translate. Julie Nelson, I'll just read this so we can get translated on the machine. Julie Nelson, a feminist economist, writes in the Journal of Economic Perspectives that many readers may have discovered that they are already doing feminist economics in some way, although they may have preferred to think of themselves as just doing good economics. Indeed, feminist economists wish they lived in a world where they did not need to use this label, right? Where economics would be done in this way just because it's economics. Okay, so this kind of brings us to an obvious conclusion then that the purpose of feminist economics is to change the world. And you might notice, if you're paying attention to what economics does, that this is quite different from standard economics, right? Standard economics says, oh no, we don't do normative things. We are a positive science, right? Just the facts. But feminist economics says, no, we're going to take a position about what should be and what should not be in order to change the world and make it better. So next slide, please. Yeah. So what's the difference then between feminist economics and gender analysis in economics? So this comes up a lot. Our graduate students often ask us this when they're taking a course in gender analysis in economics or in feminist economics. So including gender in economic analysis has become very widespread, very mainstream. And that's a good thing, of course. So in many kinds of mainstream economics journals, you can open up the journal and look inside and find articles that deal with gender differences. What feminist economics has said is that we don't want to just think about, oh, men and women have different wages, or they have different jobs, or they have different roles in the household. We want to ask, why is that? What underlies that? And what are the implications of that? Right? So feminist economics has tried to go beyond just noticing a difference and to talk about why differences exist, why they get perpetuated, and why that might be. Okay, I'm going to skip this next slide. I'm going to skip that one. Go one more. Yeah, thank you. Okay, so why feminist economics now? Why should we care about this right now? And this brings us kind of to the issue of polycrisis. Right? We should care about this now and try to change how economics is done now because we're in the middle of a number of different kinds of crises. So one is we need to address inequality across the globe. And I think that the Sustainable Development Goals are one kind kind of international recognition of the importance of addressing inequality. So this is just a graphic from the webpage of the UN, and here we see the Sustainable Development Goals. So you might notice that goal number 5, inequality of gender, goal number 1, which I can't read it on my slide, what it says. Oh yeah, so of course it's closely related to gender differences. Goal number 3, health is closely related to gender issues. Goal number 8, which is also work, of course, and having access to decent work. And then goal number 10, which is reduction of inequalities, right? So the Sustainable Development Goals have kind of focused international attention on different kinds of inequalities, and I think that's one important reason why feminist economics is so important to us now. Without understanding the principles of feminist economics, we cannot address the inequality problem. A second key reason why we need to think about feminist economics now has to do with the way that the world's populations are aging. So populations all across the globe are aging, even in countries that we think of as being relatively young. Right? So I've been doing some work on Ghana. People still think of the country of Ghana as having a young population, but in about 20 years, they're going to be having a really significant aging population too. So this is happening globally, and we don't really know why. I actually don't think it's a bad thing, but in many countries like Korea, South Korea, and in Japan, and in the United States, I would say too, part of the reason I would say that we have a declining population of working age people is gender inequality. Young women are refusing to enter into marriage and parenthood in a condition of inequality. They're just saying, no, I'm not doing that. I mean, even China, which for so many years had a one-child policy, now is trying to get people to have 2 children, and young Chinese women are like, no, because I don't have the support I need to do that. So populations are aging. So you see on the left is the kind of current population structure, and you see on the right for Brazil, by 2060, the population structure will look like that. So you don't have the fat part of the graphic in the working age population, right? So why does that matter? Why it matters is basically what we see here, that when you have a fat part of your population in the working age population, you have lots of young people who can financially pay into your social security system, into your pension system, into your tax system, so that you can support the elderly population. And as you have fewer young people, here you see like 2025, this one poor young struggling to hold up and care for that population because there are not enough people working, paying taxes, and paying into the pension fund. And of course, providing actual care, right? So that's an important issue. So here is another way of thinking about this, because someone has to provide the care for those old people, in addition to paying for the pensions and so on. And who do we think provides the care for people? Men? Women? Yeah, women, right? Women generally provide this care. So this data here show how much time women and men spend in different activities in different countries. Okay, it's a ratio. So it's the time that women spend over the time that men spend. Okay? So here we see, so by the way, I'm going to talk about the data in a minute, but Brazil doesn't collect this data. So I can't show you the data from Brazil. So here we have data from, by the way, this is also from a book by Nancy Fulbright. She was the one who gave us a nice picture of household work in the factory. Okay, so here we have 2 Latin American countries. I'm going to use Mexico as my example. So if we look at total time in work, both paid and unpaid, men and women do about the same amount of time. The ratio is about 1. But then if we look at time in paid work, we see that, women only do about half as much time in paid work as men. Well, what are women doing? Well, women are doing, where'd it go here? Let's see, care. So women are doing 3.5 times as much care work. Indirect care means cooking and cleaning, not directly caring for someone. And they're doing 2.8 times as much direct care. That means feeding a baby, washing an older person, driving their child to school. Okay? And here they're spending 3.5 as much time actively caring for their kids, like playing with them or whatever, and 3.1 times as much time supervising them. That is, maybe they're making dinner or doing something else, but they're also supervising the children, right? So part of the issue of aging is that someone has to provide care for older people, and if women provide care for older people, it has direct implications in their paid work time, which affects taxes and pensions that they can pay. It affects household ability to have a decent standard of living, and so on. Okay, speaking of feminist economics, though, wait, can you go back 1 second? Yeah. I want to just say something about this data. So this data that you see here comes from what's called the Time Use Survey. Okay? And this data is collected thanks to the UN Committee on the Status of Women, which in 1995 passed the Beijing Platform, which created the legal structure for 180 countries now collect this data using a harmonized system of data collection, so it's all the same, so we can compare it. Little asterisk there for more detail later if you're interested. And this very week is the 30th anniversary of the Beijing conference. And so my colleague, Luisa Nassif, who was invited to be here with me tonight, is instead at the UN, because there's a big meeting about the status of women at the UN this week. But this data is collected thanks to that committee and their ongoing work. And Brazil is one of the few countries that doesn't actually collect this data yet, although there is movement afoot for Brazil to now have its own time use survey. Okay, so now we can go to the next slide. Okay, so here you see just a graphic about why that time in unpaid care matters. So this is lots of different countries. Brazil, again, not here because we don't have data on the time in unpaid care work. But on the horizontal axis, you see how much time gap there is between men's and women's unpaid care work. So bigger, over here on the right side, a bigger gender gap. And here you see the labor force participation rate, what share of women participate in the labor force. And you see, a kind of general negative relationship. The more time that women, relative to men, spend in unpaid care, the less they participate in paid labor. Okay? So as I said, this has economic consequences. So next slide, please. Yeah, this one. So one of the things that people have tried to do to better understand the implications of this inequality in time in unpaid and paid work is to begin to develop macroeconomic models that include care in the model. So those of you who have looked at macroeconomic models know that the models typically involve modeling sectors of the economy, like agriculture and industry, or rich households and poor households. And so these models of the macroeconomy include the unpaid care sector, using the time use data, and the paid care sector, using, for example, administrative data on child care and other kinds of paid care. Okay? So why is it so important to include this in macroeconomic models? So I think the easiest way to understand this is this old anecdote. I think it's from Kenneth Arrow, but I might be mistaken. And it's old, so I want to point out that it seems very politically incorrect, but that's because the person who said this said it in 1960 or something. But what they said was, what happens if you marry your maid? Okay, what happens if you marry your maid in macroeconomic terms? So in macroeconomic terms, your maid was cleaning your house and doing your laundry and cooking your food for a wage in the market economy. And so all that production in the household of cooking and cleaning and so on was counted in GDP, right? But if you marry your maid and now she's your wife, now that same exact production doesn't go through the market anymore. It doesn't have a price, and so obviously it does not get collected in GDP. So if you marry your maid, GDP goes down. Right? Yeah. So this is a little tiny anecdote, but it's very important because it shows us that when we don't include unpaid work and the care sector in macroeconomic models, we miss something really big. So think about a recession, okay? We're having a recession. We might be having one next week in the United States, I think. We're having a recession, and so what happens? People take their children out of childcare. They're not working. And they don't go out for dinner anymore. And they don't send their laundry to the dry cleaner anymore. And they do all those things at home, right? What happens to GDP? Yeah, it goes down, right? And it's going down, but we don't see that actually the production is still happening, right? The production is still happening. It's just happening somewhere else. Some production has gone down. Of course, the paid work has gone down. But all these other things are actually being reproduced in the unpaid sector, right? So we cannot follow the production as it moves between the paid and unpaid sector if we don't include the unpaid sector in our macroeconomic model. So we can't accurately see how people are affected by the recession, for example. But what else we can't see is what happens if we spend more money on care, right? So suppose that I say we're going to increase government spending on care by 15%, right? Well, then we're going to see what happens in the paid sector. There's going to be more child care centers, there's going to be more paid work, but we don't see what happens with the time that was freed up from that, right? So, the government of South Korea, as I already mentioned before, they're having a terrible demographic problem, not enough workers, and lots of old people, and many women out of the labor force because they're taking care of old people. So South Korea, the government wants to get some of those women who are taking care of old people into the labor force, and who are also taking care of young people into the labor force. So they pay into the pension fund and pay taxes, so the South Korean government can take care of those old people. So the South Korean government is very interested in including care, paid and unpaid care, into the macroeconomic model. So they have worked with a group of people at American University. This project is finished now, but they worked with us to develop a computable general equilibrium model which had paid and unpaid care sectors in the macroeconomic model. So with the model, I'm just going to show you quickly some little results, but with the model that was built, what they did was they then simulated what would happen with a few policy changes. So the policy changes were these four, and two others which I'm not going to talk about. Increase government spending on child care by 0.15% of GDP. Increase spending on elderly care by 0.15% of GDP. Reduce the gender wage gap by 50%. And reduce the care wage gap. So maybe you can imagine care workers typically get paid very low wages. Think about child care workers.
The microphone.
Yeah,
Maybe need to change.
I'll try to not hold it so tight. Okay, so can you hear me now? Yeah. So yes. So care workers get paid very little compared to the average wage. You know, child care workers, workers in nursing homes. You can imagine these are not highly paid workers. So the other part of the macroeconomic model was to reduce that wage gap by 50%. So these are the, oops, next slide please. Yeah, these are the results. What I want to really emphasize, so I'm just going to talk about the blue and red bars. Those are, the blue bar is the child care spending, and the red or orange bar is elder care spending. And actually I can talk about, this is the care wage gap reduction. So what we see here is the impact of those changes. And what I want to point out is that here at the top we're seeing the impact on the GDP sector. That is the impact on the production that has prices and is counted in GDP. So when we do that change in government policy and we spend more money on those kinds of care, we see that GDP sector goes up. right? We have more child care workers, we have more elder care workers, we build more child care centers, we have construction jobs, and so on. But now, with our new macroeconomic model, which has unpaid work in it, we can see what happens in the unpaid sector. Look, this is the non-GDP sector. This was what was invisible to us before. But because we have time use data, and because we're using a macroeconomic model with the unpaid sector, and we can see what went down. So we see that the production in the unpaid sector went down a lot. Right? So this is one of the tools that we can use to trace these impacts between paid and unpaid work. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so the last thing I want to talk about, so these are the crises, right? The crisis of inequality that I was saying, feminist economics helps us understand that. Then we have the crisis of aging. So by understanding unpaid work and bringing it into our models, we can better develop policy to address this crisis. And the third crisis I want to talk about is the climate crisis, and the way feminist economics can provide us with tools for addressing this. So, next slide, please. Yeah, Latin America and the Caribbean generate only about 10% of greenhouse gas emissions in the world. But, as we probably are aware, suffer from many of the consequences of climate change. Cyclones, hurricanes, floods, droughts, etc. I read, I think a week or so ago, in the English language news site Agência Brasil, that a researcher at the Federal University of Sao Paulo has calculated that 92% of Brazilian municipalities have already experienced serious impact from climate change. So this is an important problem that we need to address. Next slide. Okay, so now what I want to talk about is tools that feminist economics gives us for addressing climate crisis. Okay, so we already saw with the example of care and unpaid housework, the way that feminist economics has taught us that we can collect data on unpriced resources and unpriced production, and we can use it for macroeconomic modeling. And actually, I left out one little piece of the puzzle, so let me just explain now. So those of you who have studied a little bit of economics of gross domestic product know that when we calculate gross domestic product, we have a system of national accounts, right? That tells us how to collect the data that we use to calculate GDP. So based on the data that we collect using the Beijing platform and the time use data, we now have what are called satellite accounts for unpaid work. So all of that unpaid domestic work and care work that's collected through time use data is now organized into satellite accounts. And literally, like the push of a button, we could include it in GDP. But we don't, but we could. Okay? So we could use the same strategy brought to us by feminist economics to include unpriced nature services in the system of national accounts, so that we would have the same missing information about the use of unpriced nature services in our economy that we now have for the use of unpriced domestic. Right? So the UN doesn't do this exactly yet, although I'll say something more about that in a minute, but international efforts have created some UN-sanctioned standards for collecting data on non-market production, right? So based on what we did for time use data, some independent researchers Ecosystems Capital Company has created accounts and tried to calculate the amount of unpriced resources we use in the economy. Okay? So the estimate is US dollars $6 to $12 trillion annually of unpriced nature services are used in the economy. Okay? So we could create, just the way that company did for profit, we could create at the UN a system of national accounts, a satellite account for collecting this data on unpriced nature resources. This would not be hard at all. We have all of the structures in place for doing so. And then, in the same way that feminist economists are arguing that we should include unpriced care and unpriced domestic work in GDP, we could also include these unpriced nature services in GDP. It would be very easy. And I want to make one other argument along these lines, and then I'm just about to wrap up. I would argue that we should also include leisure. So in the time use surveys, we already collect data on leisure time. We collect data on how much time is spent in paid work, in unpaid work, and in leisure. So why should we add leisure to the GDP? Also, by the way, the OECD already produces estimates of how much leisure we all consume. And so they already are right there. And we could put them into the system of national accounts. So why should we do that? Having a goal of well-being, right, instead of economic growth, means that we could consider leisure as a very important consumption good. Right? We all need leisure. How do we reproduce ourselves? With leisure, right? If we were to include leisure in GDP, then rather than when we take more time off, GDP goes down, right? GDP would be neutral to whether we spend our time in leisure or work. And more importantly, we could do what the French have done, right? The French decided that a full work week would be 35 hours, not 40 hours. And you know what happened when they did that? The GDP didn't grow as fast. And so there was a really interesting debate. This was like in the 1990s, I think, but there was a really interesting debate in the Journal of Economic Perspectives about this, where one economist was saying, you know, look, they took a 35-hour work week and now their GDP isn't growing as fast. And other economists were arguing, no, but their productivity has risen. They're more productive, right? But they're consuming more leisure. And of course, we can easily imagine the environmental impacts of consuming more leisure instead of more motorboats, right? Or, I don't know, what else do we consume? You know, expensive video games or other kinds of resource-consuming goods. We could still instead, you know, consume more leisure time, hang out with your friends at the beach. So, consuming the same bundle of goods and services, but working for 1,500 hours a year instead of 2,000 hours a year, this is the example here, implies an increase in one's standard of living. So this would be a kind of politically smart way of reducing, you know, zero growth is a goal that some people have to help save the planet, but it's politically problematic. Zero growth, no. But what if we just change what we're consuming, right? Then we don't have to have zero growth, we can have more leisure. So time use surveys are to collect this data. The data can easily go into a satellite account, and estimating and adding leisure time to our counting what we consume would make GDP go up by about 20%, which would probably make everybody happy. So feminist economists then can provide us with tools that would support structural change in economic sectors. We could consume more care. We could consume more leisure. And that would support a degrowth or slower growth agenda. Feminist economists' attention to non-market economic activity provides the basis for this, right? Provides the basis for valuing leisure. And incorporating these non-market values into GDP might make it easier for us to argue for reducing those resource-consuming polluting sectors. And it can extend to many environmental services, the valuation of which will certainly result in a more sustainable use. Okay, so I'm going to wrap up with that. So next slide. Good. So feminist economics argues that we need to recognize non-market and non-price provisioning, that is, things that we consume. We need to recognize structural inequality, and we need to focus on well-being. And if we do this, this will allow us to fight those three crises, right? The crisis of inequality, the crisis of fiscal problems and aging, and the crisis of climate disaster. Okay, let's stop there and give you a chance to ask questions or say whatever you want to say.
Pessoal, quem quiser fazer perguntas, né, levanta a mão que o pessoal vai... Pode ser em português mesmo, se vocês falarem devagar, a professora Mestre vai entender. Quem quiser falar inglês também pode ir treinando. Eu acho que
Thank you very much, Professor Meurs, for your insightful lecture. My English is not very good, so I wrote down the question. I have to say please. It has been truly thought-provoking to hear about the transformative potential of feminist economics. My question is about the scope of these changes. Do you believe that the shifts you are proposing, such as valuing care work and addressing gender inequalities, can be achieved within the framework of capitalism? Or does feminist economics envision a more radical transformation of the economic system itself? I'm thinking, for example, of Sylvia Federich's work in Caliban and the Witch, where she critiques capitalism for its inherent exploitation of reproductive labor and suggests that true equity might require moving beyond capitalist structures. Could you share your thoughts on this?
Yeah. Should I wait for the microphone or read it?
One more question.
Hi, Professor. Thank you for your lecture. My question is, my question is about how do you see that feminist economics can this theory deals with the idea of government spending, because there's always this debate like, oh, if you are going to take social matters into a more important place in spending, the government's going to spend more, and then you have to pay attention to how we're spending the money, and then the country can, will have less, how can I say, we'll have less money stored. So how does the idea of the theory of feminist economics deals with that?
Okay, great question. So since the microphone has given up, you can hear me, right? Yes. Classroom voice. Okay. So first question, can we do this in capitalism? Okay, that's a great question. No, I think we don't have a choice, right? So in the United States right now, we're having this kind of super capitalist moment, right? I think there are ways that we can do things within capitalism. Of course, we need capitalism to cooperate a little bit. But I think feminist economists would argue that it's in the interest of capitalism to cooperate, right, in a kind of social democratic way, right, in that kind of an argument. So the kind of super capitalist exploitation is going to result in such a climate crisis that we're not going to have a sustainable economy. And the crisis of aging and care is going to have a similar impact. Like if people don't have children because the burden of care is too high, there will be no work, right? So I think there is some room to, what's the right word, not negotiate with capitalism, but to convince that actually some of these issues are in the interest of a rational capitalism. Now, again, in the United States right now, I would say we have a moment of irrational capitalism. I don't think we can negotiate on these issues, but it's going to just cause, in my view, a big crisis. So I don't think capitalism is the preferred structure, but I think that we can argue for these things within the framework of capitalism. I also want to say that the kind of post-COVID generation, which includes you all, but also I have a daughter who's 27, I think. And also looking at her generation, I feel like maybe COVID had a role in this, but it also reminds me of I think COVID might have had a role in this, but many people are refusing to make their work their only part of their life, right? And are saying more. I want to have my work, yes, and I want to also have my family life and my social life, my life with my friends. And I feel like there's a kind of a pushback against the idea that everything should be work and production. Now, maybe that's only among certain people or certain classes or certain countries, but the more that people push back, the more capitalism has to deal with this kind of changes in priorities. So those are kind of three factors: climate crisis, aging crisis, and people's preferences changing, I think give us some leverage. But I wouldn't say that it would be, that capitalism is the best framework for this. But this is related to the other question on social spending, and I feel like our slide person isn't secured, I think. I feel like I didn't do a great job explaining the macroeconomic model, because one of the things we can do with the macroeconomic model is exactly address that issue. So right now, when all we see is the GDP part, we're seeing that the expenditures on child care go into the government budget, and we see that this is going to cost us so much. But right now, because we don't have a macroeconomic model we haven't had that really incorporates the care sector, paid and unpaid, we can't see the multiplier effects, and we can't see the spillovers. So the UN and UN Women in particular have done a bunch of kind of modeling and simulation exercises where they have looked at what are the impacts on the GDP sector, just like what I was showing here, but kind of smaller modeling effort. What are the impacts on the GDP sector of these spending on care? And in some countries, the spending on the child care or elder care expansion is almost completely offset by the multiplier effects and the impacts on pensions and taxes. This is not true everywhere. So people were really excited about this, and I reviewed a couple of studies that looked at countries in West Africa. So in West Africa, you don't get this effect. You get a very small multiplier effect and effect on government, a fiscal situation. But you know why? Because so much of the economy is in the informal sector. So people might have more jobs, but they don't pay taxes and they don't pay into the pension funds because they're working in the informal sector. So if the government needs to spend on care, but then recapture some of those economic benefits to go into the pension system and the fiscal, to create fiscal balance, then you need more formality in the economy. Otherwise, those are still resources that are being generated, but they don't help us with the fiscal problem. Right? So, but I think those studies are very important and very promising. Other questions? Comments?
Mais perguntas?
Professor, thanks for the lecture. My question is, how does feminist economics theory see the new phenomenon of the remote work on the society, considering that now for remote work, the person can do the care activities and work at the same time. Because I saw that as a difference, can be a difference in the data when we capture the data, because the person can do the both activities at the same time, then can be a help.
Can be a help or a hindrance? What was the last thing you said? Can be a
Error.
error.
You.
First of all, thank you for coming, Professor. Over here. The guy that said produce more with less. So you brought a model that will generate like $12 trillion, right? So my question is, what are we waiting for to apply that into our economical thought, right? Because we see nowadays Europe entering a period of slow growth. Other countries entering this same kind of problem. So what are we waiting if we have a solution to grow our GDP right now? Is it the extremely against this, how can I say, maybe a woke agenda? What is it that our fellows from economy see that they don't allow us to make this kind of change? Thank you.
Thank you for those great questions. So remote work, yeah, so that's a really interesting point. So there's some kind of, I don't know, in English we say rose-colored glasses, a very optimistic view of this. Like somehow magically, because you're home, you can do all the care work and cooking and the laundry and also do your job at the same time, right? So of course we know this isn't possible, and this is part of why employers are pushing back on this now, that they also see the kinds of problems that this creates. On the other hand, there are some real gains in terms of being able to combine tasks if you don't have to spend an hour or 2 hours getting to your job and getting back, right? That's time that you can use spending for care. And there, you can imagine there are some benefits, instead of spending your break talking to your work colleague who you don't like very much about the football game, which you're not interested in. Instead, you spend your break, putting the laundry in the washing machine, that's a gain. So there are some gains to be made. But there are questions about this too, about gender, right? So if the person doing the remote work is now still going to be the woman who has to then still do the housework, and it's still going to have costs on her job, as unpaid work always does, then it's just going to replicate the kind of sexist gender inequality in the workplace and at home that we've seen. So is remote work for everybody or just for women? And then kind of upside thing of this, outcome of this remote work that I want to report on is I worked with a colleague from Kazakhstan, a young economist who wanted to look at the impact of COVID and work from home on the way that couples shared housework. And it was a small sample, and it was a short-term outcome. So I don't want to claim that this is some kind of for sure fact. But what was really interesting was that, and I think some research in the United States, actually now that I think of it, the US Time Use Survey has also shown this, that after men spend time working at home, either during COVID or men who continued to work at home after COVID, they became much more familiar with the amount of work it took to run a family and the amount of work it took to watch kids, right? And they did more housework during COVID, and they continued to do more housework after COVID. So this was true in the survey data from Kazakhstan, and now the US Time Use Survey, in the most recent survey, has also shown this. That COVID coincided with a small, not as much as we would like, but a small shift in men doing more unpaid work. And so remote work might have that side benefit that if you're around the house more, you're just more aware of how much it takes to run a household. And you might pitch in more from the Okay, the what are we waiting for question. I think that's a really great question. I personally, as I tried to argue, here today, believe that politically it's smart to do these things. That it will help us address crises, but it will also help us deal with slow growth, right? It will help people feel better about their economy. Leisure is a really great thing for people, especially thinking about that question of whether we have to survive under capitalism, right? So what are we waiting for? Why are we doing this? But I taught a course for a few years at American University during which we looked at debates about how to calculate GDP. And one of the things that I had not known was that in the 1930s, there was a whole debate about whether we should incorporate unpaid housework and environmental resources into GDP. And at that point, this idea was rejected. And one of the economists, I can never keep them in the right spot, so I don't want to misattribute any of these things. But one of the economists said the reason we couldn't include housework in GDP was because it would be embarrassing. Okay, I thought that was kind of really an amazing statement. So, what are we waiting for? I don't know. I think it would be a really great idea. Change is hard, but because I really think that the feminist economists made such an important contribution to this by insisting that we collect time use data. Because really now, the cost of including these things in GDP is almost zero. We already collect the data. We already have the accounting mechanisms. We already have a system of national accounts with these satellite accounts right there. It would be very, very easy to do. And I think politically it would be very beneficial. But I'm not expecting it to happen tomorrow. Other.
More questions? Mais perguntas? Eu tenho uma também.
Thank you, Professor, for your lecture. I will apologize for my English. I'm not so good. My question is closely related to the last question you answered. Is this idea of feminist economics is being well received in economy world? But you mean like we see how that idea is amazing and is very, very well structured and makes a lot of sense, of course, but people are getting it, people are understanding it and liking it.
Yeah, that's a question, right? Are they? Yeah.
I have a question too. So you talked about including unseen work that doesn't go in GDP. So how can we do that? There's a feminist economist from Chile. Her name is Cristina Haas. And she suggests that we can change the way we measure our indicators. I don't know if this is enough, but would that be enough?
Okay, so is feminist economics well received? Okay, if we're talking about standard economics, the most basic answer is no, not really. I think it's a threat to places and people and journals and institutions which have built their reputation on a certain kind of economics. So, if you've invested a lot of resources in becoming good at something, you don't want to be replaced by something else, right? And historically, this is true, of course. People who ran printing presses are sad to have lost their jobs, and so on. So it's just part of history that things get replaced by other things, and some people lose. But right now, I would say that there is a certain amount of resistance. But on the other hand, that's kind of the pessimistic view. On the other hand, feminist economics has been widely accepted in a number of different ways. 180 countries have satellite accounts that collect time use data, right? How amazing is that? there are a number of governments in the world that want to include the unpaid and paid care sectors into their macroeconomic models, including South Korea, but not only. That's amazing. Every economics journal, basically, except for a few that I could mention, have articles about gender equality, right? Okay, it's not my flavor of feminist economics. They don't ask why, maybe, or they don't really draw out the implications, but they notice the difference, right? And you know, the same thing can be said for race. So the National Economics Association in the United States is a historic, you know, long-lasting association of Black American economists. And likewise, you know, they also are fighting their way every day into the mainstream of economics. So it's not easy, and it's not, we're not yet well received, but there are real inroads, you know, that things that used to be unimaginable are now part of regular economics, you know. And so I think that to focus on the fact that, yeah, we don't get the same amount of respect as other kinds of economics is only half of the story. And the other half of the story is, look how many things we've changed, right? The American Economics Association, which when I was a graduate student, I can tell you tales of the old days, but you know, we at the American Economics Association, which is where all US-based economists and probably many of you go to find jobs, the interviews were in hotel suites, that is to say bedrooms, and the job candidates had to sit on the bed sometimes. So I interviewed for my job in a room full of men while I was sitting in my little suit on the bed, you know. So yeah, that's how it was. And so the American Economics Association, when I was in graduate school, was still an unbelievably male, white, conservative, very narrow methodology organization. And in the time that I have been a professor, it has changed so much. The American Economics Association has a very important committee staffed by many powerful women, some of whom are feminist economists, all of whom are feminists, some of them are just kind of mainstream economists. The Committee on the Status of Women, they make very important decisions for the association. We have a big committee on race now. There's a very important committee in the organization on LGBTQ plus rights and in participation in the economy, in the Economics Association. So, you know, yeah, it's hard to fight from the outside for new ideas and new practices and new behaviors, but it's not impossible. And so I think that that's going to kind of keep our focus on that. Okay, how to include unpaid work? So I left out an important part of the story. So we collect the data on unpaid work, but then to include it in GDP, which is maybe what you were thinking, we need prices, right? We have to put prices on those unpriced goods. So how do we do that? So there are two methods that economists use to put prices on those unpriced goods. One is called replacement cost. So we collect the data, how much time is spent on cooking and cleaning and childcare, and then we would attach prices to that from how much it would cost in the market to replace this activity. So we use the cost of hiring a child care center, the cost of hiring a cleaner, the cost of hiring a cook, okay? So that's one way. Now, you know, that produces a pretty high value on the unpaid work because those are kind of specialized professions. So sometimes when we do this calculation, we use a different price. We could use the median wage. Suppose that all the work that's done in a household was just paid the median wage. Or we could say, well, maybe household work isn't that skilled. I don't agree with that, but that's a possible thought. So maybe we should just use the minimum wage. So there are a number of different methodologies, and you've probably seen the numbers. Like unpaid housework is worth, you know, this much. Well, that's where those numbers come from. And so when you calculate those numbers, you always report what method you use, right? So that's the replacement wage. The other way you can do it is you use opportunity cost, right? So what's the opportunity cost of providing those services in the home for no price? And so that, again, would be the median wage that you would have earned. Now, I think it would be great, and we could do this, that if we calculate that we always use the person's real expected wage. So if I'm a lawyer and I got my degree at Harvard Law and now I'm home caring for my baby and we're going to use opportunity cost, then I think we should use the expected wage of a female lawyer of that age from Harvard Law, right? And then someone who didn't finish high school and doesn't have too many prospects, then her wage would be a different one, right? But if we're going to talk about opportunity costs, I think we should talk about real opportunity costs, right? And we should use the actual wages. But that doesn't happen. When we do opportunity costs, we typically just use the wage. But so we do have prices, right? And for the nature services, likewise, we have the quantities, and so that estimate that I gave you of $6 to $12 trillion, those economists found the quantity, and then they attributed prices, either through markets, right, or some kind of similar good, but they decided to use kind of market prices.
Professor, thank you for your presentation. My question is how to measure the value of labor, how to measure productivity, welfare, living. Myself, I work 3 days a week, and I spend the other two days studying. So I use my leisure time to improve my knowledge. So how to measure, how to put value in leisure?
So that's a very important question. So as I have said, when economists are trying to value these unpriced consumption items or resources or whatever they are, they often turn to market prices. So you might use what people are willing to spend on different leisure activities. But I think a typical way that this leisure actually gets value is the willingness to pay technology, right? So how much would you be willing to pay for an extra hour of leisure, right? And we know that willingness to pay and willingness to accept are different kinds of valuation method measures. So we don't have a perfect measure, but there are evaluation measures. And as I said, the OECD already produces reports in which they value leisure. So it's not like feminist economists are just dream this up haphazardly. Right? There are many, many skilled economists which are already putting prices on all of these things. So we could debate with them, we could argue whether they did it the right way, but let's do that, right? Because we're deep into this already and we should just formalize it. Right?
Obrigada, pessoal, pelas perguntas. A gente vai finalizar aqui.
Pessoal, agradeço a presença de todas e todos hoje, principalmente a professora Ana. Thank you very much, ouvindo vocês das atividades do CAPS, né? Lembre-se que a semana continua, ela tem amanhã de manhã tem as palestras às 10 horas e à tarde nós vamos homenagear o professor do nosso programa, que foi professor também na graduação, e vai ser muito bacana se quem puder estar aqui conosco. Agradeço mais uma vez a presença de todos, professor Meurs, ao Bennett pelo serviço de tradução simultânea, aos docentes presentes. Pessoal, sejamos mais incisivos, mais inclusivos. A luta e o desafio da economia feminista é um desafio também de todos vocês jovens, de coração. Porque a compreensão da necessidade de inclusão, do respeito ao meio ambiente, do futuro, para além da sua individualidade, é um desafio para a humanidade. Então, ser apoiador da economia feminista é mais do que ser apoiador de uma questão de desigualdade de gênero, é apoiar o futuro do nosso planeta. Muito obrigada a todos e nos vemos por aí na Semana de Economia.